Welcome to the video presentation for Chapter 5, where we get into some more about crime scene processing and how that works. We always hope that we have something to go on, and of course evidence gives us that something to go on. So we start out the quote from Colin Powell: "No secrets to success, preparation, hard work, and learning from failure." And crime scene techs, this is what they do. They prepare, they do some hard work, and they're not always 100% perfect. They do have some failures from time to time. You learn from those, grow. So for this chapter, we're going to look at general characteristics of notes. We're going to talk about what should be considered prior to jumping into the crime scene, 5 types of organized crime scene search patterns, so different ways that we search crime scenes, especially large ones, the purpose of photography at a crime scene, 3 things that must be considered when you take photos at a crime scene, 4 types of photos at a crime scene, videotaping the crime scene sketch, 6 types of crime scene sketches, measuring techniques used at crime scenes, 3 considerations in evidence packaging, and what a control means. So when we go to a crime scene to hit the overall scene, it requires a good plan of action. So before jumping in, it's always good to take a minute and look at what's going on, survey and examine the scene, talk to the first responders who are there. Photography and sketching are one of the first things that happen because we try to preserve the scene as we originally found it. We're going to talk about that later. We do a little bit of measurement, of course, and map out the scene. Record, and that's very important because that helps in recreation. Record and documentation. If you don't record and document it, it really didn't happen when you get to court. And we look for physical evidence. You see, searching and finding physical evidence is actually one of the last things really you do. It's very interesting. Crime scene notes, of course, are very important because these are what you use to commit to a report later on. It must be detailed. You either keep them or you don't keep them. That's a policy you should set, or maybe the agency your workforce sets, because in court, those notes actually are discoverable. So you have to turn them over to the defense unless you have a practice of destroying the notes once you have committed those notes to a formal report, which is more structured. Accreditation, ASCLD accreditation for crime labs, actually provides a structure for how they wish you to take crime scene notes. Generally, crime scene notes are taken in this method in a chronological order, so as time goes by step, they should be complete. Obviously, they have to be legible because you have to be able to commit them to a report at some point in time or refer to them for testimony. Well, it's very difficult for beginning crime scene investigators, but they get better over time, is to report negative conditions. So the absence of evidence may be just as important as the presence of evidence. So shell casings at a crime scene, that may be important to note that there were none. Very specific as possible anyway, and generally it says they should not be discarded unless you have a practice that is supported by your agency to always discard them. Dates, times, pardon me, the description of the scene, the crime, the conditions, and the people who were there are all parts of the notes as well. More and more, obviously, you're seeing notes through dictation, through smartphones, through tablets. Crime scene investigators have moved on to these types of methods as opposed to the old paper, pencil, or notepad methods of the past. Although you still see that from time to time. The dates and times that should be include not just when you arrived, but when you were notified. So you may have been at the police station or in the field or whatever, the time you were notified, when you got there, and when it was completed. So that means when you left the crime scene. When describing the scene, you describe how it was when you first approached. If it's a building, that's how the scene of the exterior was. If it's a field, the same type of thing. What it was, is it a single family residence, a multi-family apartment building? What was the type of scene? Because 5 years later you may have to recall that. The location of where the primary evidence was, if there was a body, where was it within the structure, and location of evidence as you go through, and who found that evidence and who collected it as well. So the description of the crime, if you have a detective that comes up to you, for instance, and you're the crime scene investigator, and they tell you here's what happened as we understand it. You should note in your reports that that is what happened. Somebody told you, and who it was who told you, that it was not your personal observation. So you're not making conclusions. You're just accepting information that is given to you. And very, very important to note weather or lighting conditions. So if they do an autopsy later and try to determine an approximate time of death, the temperature could play a significant factor in determining that. And the lighting conditions may be important if the lights are on and it's broad daylight and they didn't need them on. That may tell you something about when the crime occurred. How the scene was. Did it look ransacked, like it was a burglary gone bad or something like that? And the condition of entrances and exits. Obviously, if anything is broken or anything like that, or unlocked, that could be a potential point of entry for the suspect or a point of exit. So, who wanted the crime scene investigator to come out or the detective? Include the name of the person who called them to the scene, everyone who was at the scene, and essentially what we do is we use what's called a contamination log. And a contamination log lists anyone who entered the scene, what time they entered the scene, and what time they left. So whoever entered and exited the scene had the potential for bringing any trace evidence with them or taking trace evidence with them out of the scene. So it's important that you know everyone from firefighters to ambulance personnel to police officers who entered and exited the scene. Sorry, so some victims may be victims of shootings and they can still talk. Suspects, of course, and the overall appearance of the scene play a role. Protection, we've already talked a little bit about in the course, but it's an ongoing concern. It's not something you can just put up a crime scene tape and feel good that nobody's going to cross it ever again. There are ongoing concerns, and it's very important that you always consider the level of protection that you need. The family often wants to enter a crime scene in a dead body or homicide case. They cannot be allowed to enter. They can contaminate the scene and hurt the case like anyone else, and that's how you have to explain it to them. Is essentially the more people we let in, the more of the potential that we can cause problems with the potential case that could occur down the road. And even command officers, if there's no reason for them to enter the scene, there's no reason they should. They can look at photographs and have the same thing accomplished. As I mentioned at the top of this presentation, photography and sketching are a very big priority when you first approach a scene because, again, you want to tell the jury later in the case how the scene was when you found it. So photographs are taken prior to anything being moved to the extent possible. Some things have to be moved for safety, but other than that, you need to take photos of everything, including the body in homicide cases or death investigations. When you go to collection, obviously we're going to take fragile evidence first as a general rule, and recall every crime scene is different, so sometimes we have to bend the rules. But as a general rule, things like blood are very important because it is so fragile. We're going to look at different search methods now, and the search areas can be extensive. It's really kind of nice, so to speak, when you have a crime occur in a house because it's all confined. But if you have a large field where you know there could be potential evidence, that creates a dilemma. And often you have to use volunteers because you just don't have enough personnel. When you go back, you package and collect that evidence, and then you move forward. So everybody has to wait until you collect. A strip search, the benefit of this is you can use fewer people and you can see, you can actually accomplish it with one person where they go back and forth, up and down through the scene until they get to the end. You can quadrant off areas and things like that and have different people responsible for different portions of the property. A grid search kind of covers things from two different ways, and you can see that it's more uh, extensive and it's harder to miss things through a grid search because you have people coming at it from both ways, and so if one person misses something, the other can perhaps see it. This is kind of an odd search, but I hear it's very commonly used in the military to find personnel who are lost, and that's a spiral search. So if you, for example, know where a plane went down, you can do a spiral search from that plane and hopefully at some point find the individual who's missing, also known as a circular search. To be honest, you don't see this used too much in crime scene investigation, but it does have other applications. A zone or quadrant search, this kind of, you can apply a strip search or any of the other search patterns to this, but essentially you break up things into different zones or quadrants and you assign a person or a search party to that particular zone. And they are responsible for that. You see this used a lot in disaster scenes like airline disasters where an airline has crashed. You will assign a team of individuals to a quadrant per GPS coordinates. They'll mark that off and they'll be responsible for finding and collecting any evidence in that quadrant. Another way you can apply a zone is to a vehicle. So you can tell you have three different officers. You can say Officer 1 is responsible for Zone A and Zone B, which is the front compartment area. Officer 2 is Zone C and D, which is the back seat. And then Officer 3 has the rest, which includes the trunk, under the car, the exterior of the car, and the engine compartment. And a zone search can apply to a structure and the fields around it too. Indoor scenes, if you have it quadrant off nicely with different rooms to search, best facilitated by two. And when you're doing the actual scene search, it is good that they work together for the most part. On occasion, you might have them separated, but if you do have them separated, you would send one investigator in, have them search, and then have the second investigator go in and research it to make sure nothing was missed. Generally, when you process crime scenes, though, this is important to remember. Two people work together, and how you do it is one does the searching, the other does the documentation. So remember that. Watch for areas of dust for prints. You can see they're using a method here called oblique lighting where they find footprint patterns here, and they know they don't want to walk on those patterns because to do a search because it could ruin some evidence. Outdoor searches, again, they present significant problems just because of the number of people who could be present. And in a big disaster type scene or an explosion, you have to remind people to not only look at the ground but also look up. There could be evidence in trees. Nighttime scenes are very difficult. The best thing to do is to wait for daylight because any artificial lighting is not as good as what can be provided by the sun and Mother Nature, but sometimes you have to search at night due to emergency circumstances. Vehicle searches include not just the inside but also the undercarriage, the exterior. Again, it's good to divide and switch. So one investigator searches an area, the other follows up and searches the same area. Different collection techniques for cars. You can use forceps the old-fashioned way if you see something with the naked eye. A tape lift sounds exactly like what it is. It's like a big piece of Scotch tape, for example, that you can put down on a seat and collect all the hairs and all the potential microscopic or trace evidence, take it back to the lab and sort through it later. And they also have what's called forensic vacuums, where you can vacuum a particular area of a car and look through the contents. So, not the way that he typically packages his. All right, we're going to get into photography and show some examples. And again, the purpose of crime scene photography is to show the items of physical evidence in the way that you found them before the investigators manipulate or move them or remove them. So you want to show the scene how you found it to the extent you can. We're often using pretty much 35 millimeter SLRs. Uh, we used to use, well, let me back up. That's what crime scene investigators primarily use, at least 15 megapixels, 16 usually, and higher SLR cameras. Of course, they used to use 35 millimeter back in the day, but not so much anymore. Crime labs could not afford processing. It's just so much easier to use digital evidence. Point and shoot cameras have their place, and they have their place because not everybody needs a fancy SLR. Police officers in the field often carry point and shoot cameras to quickly document minor cases that don't require a full crime scene processing because that still can provide useful evidence. We used to use Polaroids for the same reason. But digital, very cost effective, and again, pictures can even be incorporated into a report. We take photos at the scene with three things in mind. The jury, so how the jury is going to look at the photograph. Admissibility, will the judge let the photo in? Because if they won't let it in because it's too incriminating, then it does us no good. And the investigation, so how will this photo help the investigators aerial photos may be included in those as well. So Google Maps is nice, but it's not always 100% current. So it's pretty easy to procure a helicopter for that purpose, or a plane, and get some nice aerial photos if that's the case. It's not helpful in every case. Second type is what we call overall photos, and it kind of gives an overall view of the crime scene, the entire scene. So we're not trying to take small pictures of particular pieces of evidence. We're trying to take overall scene pictures. So again, kind of establish what you're looking at. So a picture of a room with a body in it, not focusing on the body, but the entire room, that's a good overall photo. Witness photos show the vantage point from wherever the witness was, so it can corroborate the witness's testimony perhaps later. If they said, I was hiding in the bushes when I saw the shooting happen, it's important that you go to that bush where they said that they were and you take a photo from that bush point of view to show what they could potentially have seen. You can do overlapping photos instead of doing a panoramic type photo that you see. Panoramic photos typically distort things a little bit, so instead of doing that, you'll have crime scene investigators go from left to right and just take several photos and overlap them in the future. Posed photos are very controversial. You can take them, but they're hard to get into admissibility wise. So the victim or witness may say, he attacked me and I was like this, and you pose that individual. All right, close-up or evidence photos. So these are when we're getting in closer to particular pieces of evidence to show that particular piece. So you can show the overall, then move the jury into the very close-up view of that piece of evidence. Take two types of close-up photos, one with a reference ruler and one without. That shows the size of the piece of evidence. So in this case, you can see the little reference ruler with a hole in a piece of glass. Shows you how big the hole is, and also shows you the little circles with the crosses through them. If they're perfectly circular, you know that is a perfectly parallel picture. If you distort it in any way, those circles become oblong egg shapes. So that tells you have a parallel photo, and that's important for measurements purpose. So you take it both with this ruler and also without, so the jury can see it both ways. Close-up should be taken before evidence is removed, and you can include things like blood stains, because you can do blood stain analysis, which we'll talk about later in the course. Weapons, wounds, that sort of thing are perfect for close-up photos. How many photos should you take? It's better to overshoot, and with digital, we have plenty of space, so you should take as many as you need. So it's better to overshoot than to miss that picture that would have been perfect for the case. A photo log goes along with the photos that you take, though. So you take a photo, then you write in a log what that photo was, what you were trying to get across with that photo, and who it was who took it, and the date and time. An intro photo plaque is this thing. It tells you, here's the case that we're working on, and it just provides context. Especially with digital photos, you can have 3 or 4 cases perhaps on a SD card. So you need to know which case is it that we're looking at in this photo. So that's a photo placard. So we look at different examples of photos. This is a close-up photo that without an overall or some contextual photos to show you, we really don't know what this is. So this is why a photo log is important. Overalls are important to establish what you're looking at. You see, this is like the old highlights game. What is different in this photo? See, one photo in the top left has a coffee cup, and the second one in the bottom right does not. Which photo was first? Very important to write notes about photos as you take them. This kind of shows how you might want to take overalls. So you see that if you take them from these different 4 points or corners of a room, you get the overall room pretty well. This method. And this is an example of that. You can see move around the room. You get context for the office and particular of evidence as you move around. And this is with evidence markers, so you can see where evidence number 1, number 8, number 6 are located throughout the room. Evidence markers are placed after you've taken the overalls. And then you can move in on those markers and you can show the particular evidence in a more close-up photo as you go along. So this is some blood evidence, and they've also used some tape rules too to show the size of what you're dealing with. Another overall photo, and you can see the 3 evidence markers in orange are on the countertop. Maybe hard to see, but as you move in, that shows you we got some fingerprints to consider, close-up potential blood prints. And this is one with both the markers and good overall photo with evidence markers. You want one without too, and it establishes the evidence close-up picture and what you're looking at, a bullet hole with a rule. This is an angle meter, so it shows actually a bullet hole through a box, and you can see the angle meter actually shows the angle at which the bullet entered. May be important for trajectory later. Videotaping, and you might just say, well, why not videotape the scene instead of taking photos? It seems real cumbersome to take all these pictures. Well, the answer is admissibility, because a video, if you can't get the entire video admitted into court, it's very tough to go back and cut it up into certain segments that the jury can see, and their mind starts to wander too. Why did they cut that scene out? Why did they cut that one out? So pictures are better for that purpose, but it is good to videotape on top of photos, just never to replace photos. You really can't edit a video either, because if you edit a video, that really brings up questions about the piece of evidence. I always recommend to silence videotapes. You don't need to hear what the crime scene investigators. The jury will focus on what they're hearing as opposed to what they're seeing if you have audio. And videotape with scale and no scale, just like photos. Sketching complements photography and videotaping. We see more sketching with computer diagrams these days, like total stations and other pieces of equipment, than we do hand sketches, but you still see these from time to time. It depicts the appearance of the crime scene, and it also shows you where individual pieces of evidence are located. Sketching requires 2 people, one to measure and one to sketch. The big thing about sketching is it's less messy than photos, because you can leave out material that really doesn't matter and kind of focus upon the evidence, but it still has to show the scene accurately. You can't leave out important things that could lead to interpretations of the evidence, and it has to be easier for the viewer to read as well. Sketching includes all this stuff: case number, suspect, victim, investigator. You can see bottom left shows a good example. Who did the sketch, their time, if it's to scale, what the scale is, and if it's not to scale, and distances and a legend if you need that too. If you hand do them, these are kind of what is required. This is nothing you need to know for the test. But the types, you have rough sketch. Obviously, this is one that the crime scene investigator just does roughly at the scene, kind of like notes, because they'll go back and they'll take this rough sketch, firm it up, and make it cleaner back. An overview shows from the bird's eye view. So if you're looking down from the ceiling of the room downward, it shows you exactly what where the evidence was. All the items are on one plane, the most common type of sketch. So you can imagine all the items being on one plane is not as descriptive as a 3-dimensional or even a 2-dimensional, or I'm sorry, even a wall and floor scene. So here's another overview of an exterior scene. It shows you the relation of different pieces of evidence on a street. An elevation drawing, so now you have different planes instead of just a single plane. You can see not only the floor but also the vertical plane of interest, so the walls can be very helpful for things like bloodstain evidence. Here's another elevation drawing. It shows this is the wall as opposed to just the floor. Cross projection, you take it all and you fold it down. So you can see the walls, the door, they're folded down along with the floor. So you just have to fold those up in order to make a cube again, but this is a cross projection or exploded view sketch. Another example of a sketch that is a cross projection here with the walls folded down shows bullet holes as they enter the room, things like that. 3-dimensional from a witness point of view is another way. You can see we're now moving into computerized drawings. This is kind of rudimentary. They've got better than this. Computer programs, again, you want to keep them simple though, because the whole purpose behind a sketch is to show the simple scene without extraneous material, so the jury can kind of get a feel for how things happen. Computer programs are starting to do this better and better. So you can see the jury can clearly see from this view what they're looking at, where the victim was, and associated footprints. Very nice. And here's another nice simple sketch. The jury can take this back into the jury room and they can interpret it as long as they need to. So there's a picture in the upper right that shows the actual scene and the computer generated scene, and it shows where a blood stain was on the wall. So in order to properly place evidence in a sketch, you have to measure from two different places. So one is not sufficient enough. You have to measure from two fixed points. So it could be two walls in a room. If it's on the street, it could be a fire pole or a fire hydrant, pardon me, and a power pole. You want to measure from things that aren't likely to change. So that's why you use like fire hydrants, telephone poles, and trees. You don't use cars because a car could change position, and you can't go back and measure from that point again because the car is gone. GPS coordinates are becoming used more and more, obviously. So here's another example of a sketch, and you can see how they measured from two fixed points from a wooden electrical pole, from a street ending, 2 miles to another road, 3/10 of a mile to another. So again, they used fixed points to measure to help place the evidence. All right, collection and packaging. So we want to prevent breakage, spoilage, and contamination. We want to preserve that evidence. We want to make sure it doesn't get contaminated on its way to the lab. One of the best ways to not cross-contaminate evidence is to separate multiple objects in your packaging. We're not trying to save, like at the grocery store, space in our bag. We are trying to not contaminate the evidence from each other. So we want that separated. Commonly, you mark the bag, and you can see a couple examples in the bottom left, the evidence bag with the officer's recovering initials or their name, the date, the case number, directly on the item is rare. Usually it's more on the bag or the tag. You have to be able to say this piece of evidence that you put into property and retrieved later is the same evidence that you marked and put into property at one point in time. That's the whole idea. Lab requests tell the lab, hey, I want this piece of evidence processed in the lab at a later date for this reason. General rules, any object that could have fingerprints, you want to avoid contact with the packaging that could potentially rub the fingerprint off. So you want to wedge it in there in some way. Tool marks, and we'll talk about what those are. We want to protect those from contamination and moisture. Clothing with biological stains such as blood. Wrap them separately, obviously. Pants different from shirts and that sort of thing. Avoid rubbing the evidence off. And usually we use paper bags for those too. Any wet stains, you typically use a paper bag. You don't want it to mold up, so you want it to dry naturally. The victim and suspect's clothing, obviously, we package those separately to avoid contamination. Firearms, we use boxes primarily for a rigid box. We unload those things. We take all those out and we put them in a box. So there's no way. We also usually pull the slide back or make it to where there's no way the weapon could fire. Cartridge cases, bullets that we could be looking at, lands and grooves and things of that nature, and we'll talk about what those are later. We'll put them in a box too, but often with cotton or some soft material so they don't bounce around and get scratched up. Charred paper is a good example of fragile evidence that we may want to put in a sturdy box as well. What's a control sample? A control sample is a sample from a known source, and one of the easiest ways to explain it is DNA. So we have DNA that we found at a crime scene. We want to compare it to a control sample. So we want to collect blood from an individual, watch that collection. That's a known source, and we can compare that control sample to what we collected at the scene. You have DNA at a crime scene and no one to compare it to, or the person's never been arrested, their DNA profile is not on file, you have nothing until you get that control sample. All right. Curiosity killed these cats. Things aren't always this easy.